That, ladies and gentlemen, when we speak of historic impact, we are not speaking of a moment that simply filled the headlines for a day, or two, that we are speaking of an action that will be written into the very pages of history. An action that forced the world to stop to listen to that and to rethink its assumptions. India's strike did not just send ripples through military circles, that it sent shock waves through the corridors of power in Washington, in Beijing, in Moscow. That, and in every nation that thought the balance of power was fixed, predictable, and unchangeable. This was not just a strike, that it was a statement carved into the conscience of the world that a new era had begun, and that the world would no longer look the same again. The historic impact lies in how one action redefined global narratives for decades, that India was often placed on the sidelines of international decisions, its voice heard but not always valued, that its warnings noted but not always respected. Yet in one decisive moment, India shifted from the margins to the center, that from being a spectator to being a leader, from waiting for recognition to commanding it, that is the power of historic impact. It changes perception not just for the moment, but for generations to come. What makes this strike historic is not only its execution, but its symbolism. It became a mirror to the world, that reflecting the truth that power is not inherited, it is created. The strike proved that a nation does not need to seek approval to defend itself, nor does it need to wait for validation to act in the interests of its people. That it showed that India had crossed the threshold of hesitation and entered the realm of certainty, that where every action carries the weight of authority and the conviction of leadership. This impact is also historic because it reshaped alliances. The world reacts in shock and rewrote strategies, that nations that once underestimated India were forced to reconsider their policies, to acknowledge its strength and to respect its resolve. Enemies who miscalculated India's restraint realized that silence does not equal weakness and patience does not equal fear. That friends who had taken India for granted were reminded that true partnership is built on equality, not condescension. That such shifts do not happen often, and when they do, they alter the entire trajectory of international relations. That the historic nature of this strike also lies in the awakening it brought to millions of Indians themselves. That it was not only the world that was shaken, but the spirit of a nation that was stirred, that people who had once been told that their nation was too cautious, too slow, too dependent, that now saw with their own eyes the proof that India could act swiftly, boldly, and decisively. That change in self-belief is perhaps the greatest impact of all. For when a nation believes in itself, that there is no force on earth that can hold it back. The world will remember this strike not merely for the precision of its execution, but for the power of its message. It was the moment when India declared to the world that it was not just part of history, that it was making history. Ladies and gentlemen, courage and vision are two forces that have always defined the destiny of nations. And when they come together, they create a moment that changes the course of history. India's strike was not only about the strength of its arsenal or the might of its forces. It was about the courage to act when others doubted that, and the vision to see beyond fear, beyond hesitation, and beyond the boundaries that once kept the nation restrained. That courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to rise above it. That an India rose with a strength that told the world it would no longer be confined to waiting, no longer limited by hesitation, that no longer silent in the face of provocation. This courage was born from centuries of struggle, from the memory of being underestimated, that from the weight of battles fought not only on the ground, but also in the realm of perception. That it takes courage for a nation to stand tall when the eyes of the world are fixed on it, waiting for weakness, waiting for miscalculation. But instead of shrinking, India chose to stand taller, to declare through action that it would define its own path. This was not reckless bravery, but calculated courage. The kind that understands the risks yet embraces them. That because protecting the sovereignty and dignity of a nation is worth more than the comfort of silence. Yet courage alone is not enough. That a nation may act boldly once, but without vision, that boldness fades into a momentary spark rather than becoming a flame that lights the future. That what made this strike extraordinary was the vision behind it. A vision that stretched beyond the battlefield, beyond the immediate headlines, that into the future of India's role in the world. It was the vision to recognize that power today is not about conquest, but about influence, that respect and the ability to inspire. India's leaders understood that their actions would not only secure their borders, but would also announce to the world that India was stepping into a new chapter where it is not just reacting to global powers, that it is shaping the global narrative itself. Vision is the ability to see the invisible, to believe in what others call impossible, and to act with faith that tomorrow will honor today's sacrifices. That India's vision in this moment was to rise not as a regional player bound by limitations, but as a global force guided by principle, morality, and strength. This vision carried within it the dream of a billion voices, the hope of millions who had longed to see their nation respected, and the determination to ensure that future generations would inherit a country that acts with pride, with authority, and with unshakable confidence. Courage and vision together are unstoppable. And in this moment, India showed both. It had the courage to strike that and the vision to know that the strike was not just about today, but about tomorrow. That is what shook the world. Not just the act itself, but the revelation of a nation that has found its voice, its strength, and its purpose. Ladies and gentlemen, that a declaration of strength is not made with words alone. It is made with action, with resolve that, and with the unshakable will to prove that a nation will no longer bend under the weight of doubt or pressure. That India's strike was more than a military maneuver. It was a thunderous declaration to the world that the time of silence was over, that the era of hesitation had ended, and that India would no longer ask for permission to defend its dignity. This was not about aggression, that it was about assertion. The assertion that a great nation has the right and the responsibility to protect its people, its borders, and its future without compromise. For decades, India had been spoken of as a land of potential, as a nation of promise waiting to be realized. That but potential without action is only a shadow of what could be. In this single decisive act, India transformed potential into power, then power into presence. That the declaration of strength was not hidden behind closed doors or whispered in negotiations. It was written boldly in the skies, that carried through the precision of its forces and amplified in the reaction of a stunned world. Strength beyond boundaries. Strength in this moment became undeniable and the world was forced to listen. This declaration was also deeply symbolic, that it told adversaries that patience should never be mistaken for weakness and restraint should never be confused with fear. For too long that India's measured responses had been misread, its silence misinterpreted. But when the strike came, it erased those misjudgments in an instant. That it was a clear message: India may value peace, but it will never be a passive observer in the face of threats. That clarity is what gave the strike its strength, for strength is not merely about weapons, it is about resolve. That about the willingness to act when action is demanded. A declaration of strength also redefines relationships to allies. It was a reminder that India is not a junior partner to be guided, but an equal power to be respected. To rivals, that it was a warning that provocations would never go unanswered. And to its own citizens, that it was a promise that their nation would never again hesitate when their security, pride, sovereignty were on the line. That this is the power of a true declaration. It speaks in many directions at once, and it reshapes the understanding of all who hear it. That perhaps the greatest weight of this declaration lies in its permanence. Words can fade, headlines can disappear, but the memory of a nation rising to its strength lingers forever. This was not just a response to a single incident. It was the opening of a new chapter, one where India's voice is firm, its actions decisive, and its presence undeniable on the global stage. That a declaration of strength is a turning point, and with this strike, that India declared to the world that it is ready not just to stand among the powerful, but to shape the very definition of power itself. Ladies and gentlemen, a global awakening is not sparked by whispers or quiet gestures. It is born from a moment so powerful that it compels the entire world to open its eyes and see reality in a way they never did before. That India's strike was such a moment, a spark that did not remain confined to one battlefield or one border, but spread like a wave that reaching nations far and wide, forcing leaders, strategists, and ordinary people alike to rethink the balance of power and the direction of history. This was not just an Indian event. It was a world event, that a reminder that no nation can be underestimated and no narrative is ever permanent. The global awakening lay in the realization that India had risen beyond regional boundaries and had stepped into the realm of global influence. That for too long the world had spoken of India's growth in terms of potential as though it were a promise waiting for some distant future. But in one decisive action, India showed that the future had arrived, that its power was no longer a projection but a present reality. That nations that had measured India's strength only in economic terms suddenly saw its willpower, its strategic clarity, and its courage displayed in action. The awakening was not just about recognizing India's capability, that it was about recognizing India's place in the hierarchy of world powers, that this awakening also came with a shift in how nations viewed their own strategies. That countries that had long relied on outdated assumptions about India's restraint were forced to redraw their maps of risk and opportunity. That rivals who believed India would remain cautious and limited saw that patience had its limits, and that when those limits are crossed, that India's response would not just be strong, it would be unforgettable. Allies who had taken India's partnership lightly realized that this was not a nation to be guided, but a partner to be respected and treated with equality, that this adjustment in perception was a global awakening in itself. For it forced nations to look beyond their old frameworks and to recognize the dawn of a new balance of power. But perhaps the deepest layer of this awakening was emotional and symbolic around the world. That ordinary people, those who have felt their own nations overlooked, their voices unheard, their dignity challenged, saw in India's action a reflection of their own hope. They saw proof that power can rise from patience, that strength can emerge from silence, and that when a nation chooses courage over compromise, that it changes not only its own destiny, but also the story of the world. India's strike became a lesson to the powerless that no one remains powerless forever. That and to the powerful that no one remains unchallenged forever. This global awakening is not temporary, that it marks a shift that will shape the years to come. It has redefined how nations view leadership, courage, and sovereignty, that it has shown that the balance of power is not locked in history, but is always open to change. And in this awakening that the world has come to see India not as a follower of destiny, but as a creator of it. Ladies and gentlemen, there are moments when the roar of weapons and the display of military might seem to dominate the world. But history has always shown that truth carries a force greater than any arsenal. Truth over power is not a slogan, that it is a principle that can shake empires, redefine alliances, and inspire people across the globe. That India's strike was not simply about proving strength through firepower, that it was about proving that when a nation acts with conviction rooted in truth, even the most powerful must pause, listen to that, and acknowledge what cannot be denied. Truth is the bedrock upon which real power stands, and without it, power becomes fragile, vulnerable, and hollow. India's action carried the undeniable truth that it would no longer tolerate threats to its sovereignty. That it would no longer remain silent while its people and borders were challenged, and that peace cannot be one-sided. It requires respect, that equality, and fairness. This truth shook the world more than the strike itself. That because it was a reminder that real strength is not about domination. It is about justice, and justice resonates far deeper than intimidation ever could. That the global stage had grown accustomed to power being concentrated in the hands of a few, that with narratives written and rewritten to suit their interests. This moment reminded the world that truth does not bend to narratives, that it breaks them apart. India did not act to seek approval or applause. It acted because the truth demanded it. And when truth drives action, that it gains a legitimacy that no propaganda, no denial, and no manipulation can erase. Even those who sought to criticize the strike could not deny the reality that India had spoken with authenticity. That an authenticity carries a power that resonates beyond borders. This principle of truth over power also inspired millions within India itself. That for citizens long accustomed to hearing others define their nation's role. This was a moment of clarity, that the strike was not just a military maneuver. It was a moral stand, an affirmation that their nation would not be bullied, silenced, or sidelined. That when people see truth guiding action, awakens in them a sense of pride and belonging that no material achievement can provide. That and when a billion voices stand united in that pride, that the world is forced to recognize a power greater than weapons, the power of belief in what is right. On the international front, that the truth carried by this strike altered calculations everywhere. For rivals, that it was a lesson that deception and aggression could no longer be hidden behind the mask of power. For allies, that it was a reassurance that India's partnerships are built on integrity, not manipulation. For neutral observers, that it was proof that global politics is not only about who has the biggest arsenal, but about who stands most firmly for what is just and fair. This is why truth is mightier than power, because power may command fear, but truth commands respect, and respect lasts far longer than fear ever can. India's strike reminded the world that in the contest between power and truth, that it is truth that ultimately triumphs, because truth carries within it the strength of permanence, the clarity of justice, and the authority of what is undeniably real. Ladies and gentlemen, throughout history, there have been turning points when the world shifted. That when old powers lost their grip and new voices emerged to redefine the global stage, these moments are rarely quiet, and they are never accidental, that they come with bold actions, with declarations that can no longer be ignored. And with the undeniable rise of nations that refuse to remain in the shadows, India's strike was one such moment, that a spark that signaled the birth of a new world order, one not defined by the dominance of a few, but by the awakening of many. For decades, that the global order had been shaped and guarded by a handful of nations, often leaving others to play supporting roles. Power was centralized, that influence was monopolized, and decisions were made in circles that excluded much of the world. When India acted with decisive strength, that it challenged that monopoly. That the strike was not just a military maneuver, it was a reminder that global authority is not a permanent inheritance of a few nations, but something that can be reshaped by courage, vision, and the will of a rising people. India's voice was not asking to be heard, that it demanded to be recognized, and in that moment the stage of global politics began to shift. That this new world order is not about replacing one superpower with another, it is about rewriting the rules of respect, equality, and influence. That India demonstrated that leadership in the modern age is not just measured by economic size or military might, but by the ability to act with conviction and to inspire belief. It showed that a nation rooted in democracy, guided by principle, and fueled by the dreams of its citizens could no longer be sidelined. That the strike announced to the world that India is not simply responding to history, it is now shaping it. That the impact of this shift was felt everywhere. that rivals who once assumed India's restraint would keep it contained had to face the reality that their calculations were outdated. That allies who once viewed India as a junior partner were reminded that true partnerships are forged only when both stand as equals. And nations across Asia, Africa, and beyond saw in India's rise a reflection of their own aspirations, that the world is no longer the property of a few powers, that but an open field where determination and unity can elevate any nation. This is what makes it a new world order, the redistribution of influence, the acknowledgement of new players, and the rise of voices that had long been overlooked. That what truly makes this moment historic is the fact that it inspired both respect and recalibration. Respect that because India's courage earned the world's attention in a way no speech or negotiation could. Recalibration that because nations now know that the balance of power cannot remain static, it must shift with the realities of the present, that this is how new world orders are born, not in theory, but in bold, irreversible acts that redefine how nations interact, how they align, and how they compete. India's strike will be remembered as more than a response to a challenge, that it will be remembered as the moment that signaled to the world that the age of exclusivity is over and the age of equality and power has begun.